Hello.
Hello, Rodney. How are you?
Yeah, I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. It's good to speak to you again.
Yeah, thanks.
So
Uh,
yeah, no, go on, please.
no, so I'm just wondering what you want to cover today.
Right. So I on account of you being a Plato expert. That's how you were first how I first became aware of you. That's how you were described to me. Um,
Yeah, okay.
yeah, I thought sort of, and I mean as Plato is sort of, how do I phrase this? He's probably the most preeminent figure in tradition that's directly associated with politics. I mean, he's the one that you will study in sort of in the mainstream study of politics. I don't want to say political science, but in political
Yeah,
theory, he's the only traditional figure. Well, Aristotle also, but
yeah.
Plato's more.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
Correct. I think that uh, I think it's, for a start, I think it's good what the enterprise that you're undertaking, because the perennialists, the traditionalists, weren't overtly political,
Mm.
with a couple of exceptions, of course, but the main ones weren't. And the traditionalism throughout the 20th century wasn't a conspicuously political movement. But so that whole area has been neglected somewhat, I think. And as you say, the place to start is Plato, isn't it? At least in the Western tradition.
Well, yes, indeed, and also he's more I mean, what you say, at least in the Western tradition, I think that's probably an oblique reference to Confucius. Um, but the Confucius is less systematically political than Plato. He's and yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah,
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 I put it that way. A lot
yeah.
of yeah. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in parallels and reflections between that aspect of the Chinese tradition and Plato, and I sort of explore it in particular ways. And one of the ways I explore it is in through the I Ching,
Mm,
not as an oracle, but as a book of statecraft. And I think there are a lot of Platonic parallels between the I Ching as a book of statecraft and, say, the Republic, surprisingly. So when I say Plato as the preeminent Western representative of this, you're right. The Confucian, Neo-Confucian tradition is the parallel in China, and I think there's a lot of similarities between the two, that haven't really been explored.
well, I mean, it's very interesting because one hears, particularly with Neo Confucians, of the similarities in their metaphysics. Um, but you're right that the similarities in their politics is very underexplored, and I mean that's very salient to my project. So is there a little more you could say about that, because I think that'd be very interesting.
Well, I think how it works in practice is, um, in both cases, what you have is essentially a vocational order, a vocational
Mm,
society, or polity. And the difference is that, say, in the I Ching as a book of statecraft, the whole metaphor throughout it is the family and the relationship between the various members of the family and the appropriate positions within the family and the particular tasks of the members of the family. And that is to say, their vocational positions. Whereas in Plato, the family is not the metaphor. The polity is in the Republic. So that's sort of the obvious difference on the surface of things. But they're both talking about um, the a particular political vision, which is vocational, and which is also what you have in the Indian tradition too.
mm, mm.
The caste tradition. The castes are essentially different vocations. They all have different purposes within the greater organism. That's very characteristic of Platonic thought, I think, political thought, wherever you find it.
And one might then be able to identify something that's sort of universal to tradition is this concern with a vocational political order. I mean, you see that in the estates of the medieval Western order. I'm less familiar with how that, if there's a parallel to that in the Islamic political order. Maybe could you say something about that, or?
Well, in that, I guess the obvious point of contact there is that the traditionally the Sufi orders were craft orders. There's lots of them named after various particular crafts, whether it's the wool dyers or the wood turners or that chains of initiation in the Islamic world and elsewhere were often associated with crafts and with particular industries, and the passing on not just of technical knowledge, but the technical knowledge as a set of symbols for spiritual life.
So there's a couple of different directions I want to go within this, and I'm sort of thinking about which way to go first. But let me ask you this. I remember reading you write somewhere that the Republic shouldn't be, and you're gonna have to forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing what you've said. I was looking for the source and I couldn't find it. That the Republic shouldn't be read principally or even at all as a political text, but that the political concepts in there are primarily or entirely metaphorical for spiritual realities. Am I characterizing your position correctly there, or?
Well, I think that I think on one level that's correct. The whole thing is metaphorical, and we find that out along the way. Socrates says, what does he say? He says, this is actually the city writ large in the heavens. It's an ideal sort of arrangement. And that the different constitutions are constitutions of the soul, not of particular polities. But of course, it's also true that they are polities. It's a text that works on all different levels. Because there's a parallel between man and state throughout implied throughout the Republic and through other places in Plato too. So that the state as man writ large is what's implied there. But you can take it the other way and read the whole thing as a spiritual text, and many people have.
But that doesn't invalidate the reading of it as a
no, it doesn't.
Political treatise.
No, it doesn't. But the question becomes which one's the primary reading, and then you get to the end of the Republic, and what you get, of course, is the myth of You realise at the end you're told that the whole thing is about the cycles of birth and death, and on this very cosmic level. Whereas all the way through, you've been talking about the particulars of a state. Finally, at its climax, the Republic takes you to the myth of It ends with that myth. And one argument is that the whole text has been leading up to that point, and that the myth of conditions the rest of the text.
And that's very interesting.
The other peculiarity here is that the deity that presides over the Republic, if we go to the other end of the Republic and start at the beginning, is Bendis, which is in fact a form of Hecate Artemis. Hecate is the deity who presides over the Republic, which is a very strange thing. It's very important in Platonic dialogues what festival they're set on and what deities rule over the particular areas of discussion. In the Republic, it's hard to determine because we're dealing with a an imported goddess, Bendis. So the introduction of a foreign cultus into the polity, which is important to the whole thing. But the deity is, in fact, Hecate, the goddess, the dark goddess of the underworld. And that doesn't make any sense at all until you finally get to the myth of her at the end, and you're in the underworld. So that in some ways you can read the Republic as this long descent into the underworld.
I mean, it's very.
So it's a very complex text, but as a political text, it works on that level too. It's a description of a set of constitutions.
Right, and a normatively arranged description. So I mean, maybe this is a pedestrian question, but let me ask you it anyway. How seriously do you think Plato saw the rule of philosopher kings as a viable reality? I mean, do you think that's what he was up to in Syracuse, trying to establish?
This depends upon how you read Plato in context, I guess, often, because we have this whole biography of Plato about and this story about how he tried to convert the tyrant of Syracuse into a philosopher, and that he was thrown into slavery and brought out of slavery and so forth. This whole misadventure that is ascribed to Plato. I'm sort of... I try not to import that sort of thing into the dialogues because, for a start, Plato is very careful to be anonymous in the dialogues. He's never there, and so I don't import him into it. And secondly, I'm not sure about that whole biography. All of that's late. That's very late material. We don't actually know very much about Plato, so I don't condition my understanding of it through that biography or even the letters, but just the dialogues, what we find in the dialogues. And in the Republic, I think it's Plato proposes that there is such an age in which there is rule by philosopher kings. But I don't suppose that the Republic is a program for how to achieve it, or even that it is achievable in any immediate or real sense. That is to say, it may be mythological in that sense. But all the same, it doesn't change the fact that the single point of Platonic politics is Sophia, wisdom. The Platonist just wants wise government. That's all, a wise ruler. And the question is, how do you find one? Where do you find one? And in the Republic, we're told that it's much more likely in some constitutions than in others. And we're also told that there won't really be any strife until we get one. Any end of strife until we get one.
So there's this eschatological element to the Republic, where one constitution degenerates into the other, and perhaps I'm forgetting something, but what I don't recall being in the Republic, and maybe I could be criticized for not having reread it for this conversation, but I don't recall it having a programmatic element in the sense of there doesn't seem to be much suggestion that you can reverse that process of degeneration.
Of decline.
Is that
no?
Right. So okay.
No, that's right. Plato believes that there is inevitable decline. What's the source of this decline? It may be just in the very nature of things. It's like the weather.
Mm.
And so the Platonic politician, what they do is they have to determine where are we in the cycle and what is even possible at this stage. That's part of wisdom, taking account of what's even possible. Where are we? I think the I Ching is an example of that. It tells you where you are in the cycle and how the wise man responds. So it's sort of
Which calls to mind.
What you get in the.
Sorry, go on.
Sorry?
No, please continue. Don't let me interrupt you.
No, I was just going to say you sort of get this sort of situational ethics in I Ching. Where are we in the cycle and how do you respond to that circumstance? But the Platonic cycle is the same. It's just a cycle of decline, and it's irreversible. There's nothing you can do about it. Although, both in the Chinese tradition and I think also in the Platonic tradition, there is the possibility for what Confucius calls the rectification of names.
Mm.
That is to say, where someone intervenes and restores some semblance of vocations. So a carpenter's a carpenter again. The rectification of names.
Well, it does. What I was going to say is it brought to mind a passage in the Analects where Confucius says that when the way prevails, a gentleman is it would be unbecoming for a gentleman not to be engaged in politics, and when the way does not prevail, a gentleman allows himself to be folded up and put away.
Yes. Yeah.
But what you were just saying just now. Sorry. If you want to comment on that, don't. I'd like to give you the airtime.
Just on that note, you did have different responses to circumstances. My mentor, Roger Sauter, a Platonist, he just took the view that this is not an age for Platonists. This is not an age for political engagement. I don't think that's entirely correct. I think that Platonists have something to contribute to every age, politically and otherwise. But perhaps, I'm sure that he would say no. The wise man at this point just withdraws.
I mean, it's a very it's a knotty question and one I'm working on in my own writing because I mean what I'm quite convinced of is that a kind of restitution is impossible at this juncture. There's no going back to the philosopher kings until the cycle's played itself out. But does that completely? So that kind of political action, the sort of Sorelian myths that really motivate people, that I'd put on the shelf and forget about. But that doesn't completely exhaust all possibility for political action. I mean, there's much more limited, less ambitious activity that would still constitute political action. I mean, for example, resisting a particular discrete injustice. And I consider, maybe there's room for something there.
Yeah. That's right. I agree with that. I think there's always room for some sort of political action. But the question is how much. As for restorationism, there's a school of thought that says all that's necessary is the application of the right amount of force, which is sort of the totalitarian answer that we saw in the early parts of the 20th century. As someone described the Nazis as going on with tanks.
Which I don't think sorry, go on.
Which I don't think is a fair description, but all the same, I get the point.
That was Morning of the Magicians, wasn't it? I think that's the source of that quote.
Is it? Yeah, I'm not sure.
It's one of if it's not that book, it's some sort of something in that genre. But going back to Plato, I know you were just saying that you're skeptical of this biographical account of Plato, but there is this interesting parallel there with his entanglements in Syracuse, and Confucius's, I can't remember if it's 12 or 13 years, but the decade plus he spent trying to convince the various,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
That is true. That's true. But I'm really not sure about Plato's biography, and so I really try not to. And also his connection to Aristotle, but that's another question. See, once we start in the Western tradition, once we start talking about returning to classical politics and classical political thought, the obvious place to go is Plato and the Republic. But there's always people who jump up and say, well, what about Aristotle? This is the particularly in the Catholic camp, they think that real political thought in the West is embodied in the Aristotelian tradition more than in the Platonic, and you get that view, I guess, in someone like Karl Popper after the war, who thinks that Plato's the problem. Plato's the source of all our problems.
Yeah, I mean, there's this who is it who said that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato?
It's Whitehead.
Whitehead. Yeah. But there is this sense in which, and particularly amongst political philosophers, all modern Western philosophy, it kind of uses Plato as its punching bag. It's all opposed to Plato.
But it's also extracted from Plato. You can extract, a communist utopia from Plato if you want, or fascism if you want, or almost any constitution in some ways. There's even passages in Plato where he admits that there's one where he admits that sometimes democracy is the best you got.
Well, I mean that gets to something. As I say, there's sort of various threads I want to go follow with this, and I'm sort of struggling to what the best order to address these things is. But actually, let's go with that then. Aside from the Republic, there's the Statesman. So, how do you read those two texts? Sort of, what's your hermeneutic circle in reading those two texts in conjunction?
Yeah, I mean, well, I have a particularly peculiar approach to Plato, so I'm not the best representative of the political Plato, and so I'm not really deeply immersed in the Statesman in particular. Only through the Timaeus. There are lots of parallels between the Statesman myth, the myth in the Statesman, which is about the cycles and the spinning of the earth, that particular myth, and about how the dead will rise from their graves like newborn babies, and all of that time reverses. All of that's in the Statesman. As for the dialectic in the Statesman, a lot of it I find really quite tedious. They're trying to define what the Statesman is, and they start off by some really quite silly distinctions. But obviously there's lots of great stuff in there. But for me, the myth in particular is what stands out in the Statesman. So that's how I come at that particular dialogue, and how I come at Plato in general through the Timaeus. That's my starting point with Plato. So I'm more interested in the cosmological Plato, but that is very political in itself.
So the Timaeus.
Because one of the central themes in Plato is autochthony. The boast of the Athenians is that they are autochthons, unlike other Greeks. They are born from the soil. They are native. They are aboriginal, unlike everybody else. And that Sophia, wisdom, is a characteristic of the Athenian autochthons. And it's a spiritual characteristic aristocratic Athenians were given, gold necklaces and gold jewelry at birth to symbolise their gold as a symbol of autochthony. Now, this is a constant theme throughout Plato. The native versus the foreigner. That's why the Republic starts with Socrates goes down to the Piraeus to see this festival that all of the foreign workers have introduced into Athens. They're introducing a new goddess and a new festival. And he's going down to see it. There's this constant tension between the local state and the people of the soil and the wider world, the cosmopolitan world. And Plato, in terms of his biography, that's as far as I really want to go. Plato is an Athenian aristocrat who is also a cosmopolitan man. He probably went to Egypt. He probably he almost certainly went to Magna Graecia. He saw the wider world. And his problem is, how do you fit this city into the cosmopolitan world? And that's the particular politics of Plato that I pursue. But that's my particular reading of Plato, and not a normative political reading of Plato, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's... Sorry.
It seems to me a very contemporary problem, though. I mean,
well, yes,
the indigenous, the native people, the people of the United Kingdom versus immigrants, for instance. That's and I think Plato. There's a lot about that in Plato, and then you could find that we can extract a lot of stuff in Plato about that.
Oh, could you give a concrete example? I mean, I think that's very interesting.
Well, I guess the big move, which comes through Parmenides, what I think Plato does is he gets this idea of the Athenian autochthony. They're born from the soil. We're born from the soil. The soil, for Plato, is a symbol of the ground of being, and that the autochthon is an authentic man who was born from the ground of being. I think that's how he does it, and so you can be a spiritual autochthon.
Hmm. Hmm.
But each autochthony, each city-state, each land that has each ethnos, each people, they all claim autochthony, that this is our land, we came from this land, we are children of this land, and all of that, which is also the noble lie in the Republic. In each case of that, for Plato, I think he understands that it's only authentic if it's grounded in a universal metaphysics, which he finds in Parmenides.
Maybe I'm reaching too far with this, but and please do correct me if I am, but it seemed appropriate given that you're Australian. You said earlier that the Greeks, sorry, the Athenians viewed themselves as being the only autochthonous people in Greece, as opposed to say the Spartans. Right, and so if you compare the Athenians to the British, in which case maybe it seems appropriate to compare the Spartans to the Australians, right? I mean, it's a people that finds its ethnogenesis, to borrow a term from Gumilev. Into immigration to a place and displacement of a local population.
Yes.
So So maybe does that limit or does that change
Yeah,
how this kind of um, what an American or an Australian can take from Plato in this regard?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's sort of there in Plato, but you have to look further beyond it into archaeology and other sources. The way that the Greeks transferred cities from the mainland to Magna Graecia. You know, Timaeus comes from Locri, but he comes from Western Locri, and it's a Locri that has been transplanted into Italy. Now, how is that done? In the ancient world, a city's not just a social contract. It's not just something you can set up in the way that Australia or America was. Rather, I mean, for instance, I've read a PhD thesis about this some time ago. There was the carrying of a sacred flame from the old city to the new city, and elaborate rituals to move the cultus and the gods from one place to another. The city has to be founded upon a divinity. You can't just stick a colony somewhere. Well, that didn't happen in the case of Australia. Certainly, it was a prison colony. Perhaps in America there was some religious motivation, and there's certainly a vision of America as the promised land, or a religious vision of America. Yeah, not so in Australia.
Although one wonders, I mean, how well that vision's been preserved, or I mean, in the American case. Although
Yeah,
it does when you speak of the flame. Have you read Fustel de Coulanges' The Ancient City?
the ancient city. No.
Oh, okay. I wanted to ask your opinion of it. It's about sort of the religious foundations of law
Oh, yeah.
in Greece and
Okay.
Rome.
No, I've seen it quoted, but I haven't read it. No.
The only reason I bring it up is because the hearth fire plays a very very big part in de Coulanges' analysis, and I wanted to ask if you had an opinion about that, but if you haven't read it, it is sort of a little bit of a non sequitur of a question, but it's just something that popped up while you were speaking. We started by comparing the Chinese tradition and the Platonic tradition. And one thing that's very distinctive in both of those is this kind of meritocratic element in the what's the word I'm looking for? In the Constitution.
That's right. There's mobility. It's not a fixed caste system. Even in the Republic, the philosopher kings can come from any class. Yeah.
And that's Confucianism is quite famous for having a very similar attitude. Now there's something Coomaraswamy once said, I believe, about the Republic, this was just a corrective to an earlier to the disordering of castes that would have earlier been much more, he asserts would have been the same as the Indian arrangement. And I assume he would have said the same thing about Confucius, which is also interesting to me because, as I understand it, there is some evidence that the Hindu caste system had greater mobility at one point before ossifying. So I just wanted to see could you comment on that one or the other?
Yeah. That's my understanding too. When I was in India, people would often tell me that, but I don't know whether that was. I didn't know whether that was just people's criticism of the caste system. You hear lots of criticisms of the caste system, especially among educated people, and they'll tell you routinely that it never used to be like this and so forth. But I don't know whether that's true. I suspect that it is, but it certainly is true in the Republic, and as you say, in Chinese meritocracy. It's because, as I say, the wise king, the philosopher king, can come from any class. It's Plato just allows that's a possibility.
So
a constitution must allow for it.
So what do you think of Coomaraswamy's charge that this is a correction for an earlier situation that was much more rigid, that's become confused? I wish I had the
I'm not
quote
sure.
on hand.
I'm not sure. I know that argument, but I'm not. It depends. The argument depends upon Indian text, Vedic text, and things that I'm not really qualified to make judgments about. And unfortunately that's often the case with Coomaraswamy. So I can't really comment on that, or whether that's the case or not.
I mean, I'm sorry, go on.
Just as a general proposition, it probably is the case that originally you don't need that sort of. There's all the things are in their right place, and so you don't need mobility. And that's only when there's some sort of disruption that you have to allow mobility, because unusual things have started to happen. That's a possible way of reading that. Yeah.
I mean, I wonder if the two can be reconciled in some way. That as we go further into decline historically, and societies become more complex, castes emerge gradually, right? I mean, the typical account is that if you go far back enough, everyone's a Brahmin. So as sort of lower castes emerge, that would be the sort of could be the kind of disruption you're talking about. And then, practically speaking, wouldn't there be some measure of meritocracy, how people get sorted into different castes in the first place?
As a correction for the situation, Yeah, I can see that, and I know that argument in Coomaraswamy, but I haven't pursued it in Indian sources and the sources that he uses for that.
So that does lead to something else I wanted to ask you about, going back to the Republic, and it's something I see very little talked about. So when you have your system of constitutions, and starting with the philosopher kings, there's, at least on my reading, there's another constitution before that I believe Socrates sort of dismisses, and it's the the city of, is it the city of cows or the city of cattle, or this very simple arrangement.
Yeah.
And there seems to be very
the primitive city, or the I don't know. I don't really know where that fits into the arrangement. You get two narratives in Plato. You can find two narratives in Plato. You can find the progressive narrative. After the flood, everyone retired to the high points and lived in caves, and gradually rediscovered fire and started rubbing sticks together and put together a civilization again. That sort of progressive narrative. But there's also the narrative of constant decline. And the two things go side by side in Plato, which is characteristic of Plato. But where that particular bit fits in, I'm not sure. I like the parable of the ship in the Republic. I think that sums up Platonic politics very well, which is where you have a ship at sea that is lost, and the rudder's broken, and the captain's down, and no one knows where they're going, and the only person on board that is not clueless is the person they dismiss as a dreamer who just sits around and does nothing. He's a good for nothing. He just sits around and gazes at the stars all day. But in fact, the stargazer is the person that knows the map. Plato thinks that the philosopher king's like that. He's the man you least expect. He's the person you think of as the dreamer. And so on, in that particular parable.
Mm. And yeah, and you have
And
the
on the ship, they try everybody. They try everybody. And finally, they turn to the stargazer.
which does.
And what's the
Sorry, go on.
advantage of the stargazer? The advantage of the stargazer is that he sees a bigger picture.
Oh, sorry. There's something in that though, in that the parable that, it does suggest that a cycle of alternative constitutions have to be exhausted before the philosopher king is turned to. That they turn to everyone else
It
first.
does, yeah. Yeah, they try everybody else first. That's right.
Have you read just as an aside, because it comes to me. Have you read Ted Kaczynski's Ship?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have.
I quite enjoyed that.
I had students who are big TED fans for a while.
Yeah, he has his. There's quite a bit of value in him, but I think, not the strategic element.
No, but it's interesting that he's a very high functioning. He was a very high functioning individual, and lots of they're very interesting cases. Such people.
Yeah, and I mean, but there's a lot, kind of substantively in his ideas that I find very compelling about the kind of the nature of technology and what that does to humanity, and I think that has certain resonances with Genon, but also what he has to say about his positive evaluation of primitivity, and it gets lumped in with the John Zerzens of the world, which I don't think he actually has much.
Yeah.
But I think there's actually this resonance between what Kaczynski says and Schuon, and there's certain passages in Schuon that are quite resonate with what it is that Kaczynski finds positive in the primitive way of life, in the hunter-gatherer way of life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because against
I personally, by temperament, I think I personally don't relate to that particular aspect of either Schuon or Ted Kaczynski, but I know what you mean, and I understand the attraction of the primitive, but I also think that it's an aspect of modernity. I mean, primitive art is modern art. Picasso and all of those, they rated primitive art. So I mistrust the primitive for that reason. And the adage that I like to use is the primitive is not the primordial.
Well, maybe there's something very, very, very Socratic in you then, because Socrates didn't have much time for the or didn't seem interested in engaging with the primitive city of cows.
No, he headed straight for the agora where the action was.
I'm sorry, I'm just consulting my list of. So, you said that Timaeus had a very very political element to it. Is there anything else? Any other texts of Plato's that you think discuss politics that are sort of get overshadowed by the Republic and the statesman?
Well, the laws.
Oh, well,
the laws.
Yeah.
Which is a very misunderstood or misrepresented sort of work, although it's very it's quite considerable and vast. And some of it, we're not sure what to make of it. You don't know quite how to fit it into the rest of Plato's works. But that's another thing about Plato. I don't, as a general rule, I don't abide by or follow the accepted chronologies of the dialogues. I don't say, oh, this is an early one and this is a later one. And by the laws, even Roger Sauter, he said he didn't like the laws. He thought by the laws Plato had lost it. He'd lost the plot. I don't read Plato like that.
Is there any?
So the laws, I think, is a very, very valuable source of ideas.
So, could you go into a little more depth about what do you think is misunderstood about the laws?
Well, Plato's distancing himself from things there because it's not a Socratic dialogue. Socrates doesn't make an appearance, and there's anonymous people, and we really don't know what to make of it. And so there's all these discussions about the practical running of a state and what sort of laws you need to run a decent state. But it's a very much lower level sort of discussion than you're getting in the Republic, which is about political philosophy. It's about high-minded ideas. On the surface of things, the laws seems to be much more about specifics and particulars. Some of it, to modern taste, seems very disagreeable, and some of it's very interesting. But how it fits into Plato is hard to say. That's where I look to someone like Leo Strauss, who's a very inventive and creative reader of Plato and political reader of Plato.
I mean, does Strauss have anything to say about the laws specifically?
Oh, he has he has a lot to say about the laws. And from my point of view, the connection with the laws is there's this strange business in the Timaeus and Critias. At the end of the Critias, Zeus is going to punish Atlantis, and suddenly the dialogue is cut off in mid-sentence. And we're looking for the extra speech, and we're looking for also the foreshadowed speech by Hermocrates. And there's a large section in the laws that would correspond to that, arguably. And so, for some reason, one way to read it is that Plato gave up on the Timaeus Critias ensemble and used that material, recycled the leftover material in the laws for a much different purpose. But I'm not sure that that's the right way to read it either.
So,
most infamously in the laws, of course, there's a passage which recommends the death penalty for atheists. So you'll find that it's a favourite passage of people like Bertrand Russell and all of those sort of atheists who want to use it to slander Plato.
It's a shame yeah. I mean, it's a shame because if we had Plato's way, we wouldn't have to deal with the Bertrand Russells. Yeah, no, I mean they're a great advertisement for the argument. But what I was trying to ferret out was is there and I should have thought of the laws, but are there any more obscure and sort of neglected dialogues or texts of Plato's that you think are sort of salient to this politics?
Not in my particular orbit. I'm sure there are. In some ways, all of Plato's dialogues are political. I mean, even the Menexenus, which is just a long speech about a patriotic speech, but that's where you get the autochthony myth. That's very political and very important. But it's also a very strange dialogue. You get to that and you think, why did Plato even write this? This is so out of character. This is so different than all the rest of the dialogues. Is it even by him? But in fact, it fits into the political aspects of Plato's dialogues very well.
Well, sorry, again, this is a bit of an aside, but that hints towards something I wanted to ask, which is there any philological support to the idea? Now, I haven't encountered this idea. I'm just wondering if this is an idea that's ever been raised in Plato scholarship, that Plato was a corporate person, that there was more than one person writing under the name Plato.
Yeah, again, I don't think we can answer those questions. I don't know who Plato was, to be honest. I mean, for a start, it's his nickname. Secondly, he very carefully removes himself from all these writings. And thirdly, all the biographical stuff we have is of a much later date. Certainly things like the epinomis, which is means after the laws. The epinomis is a product of the Platonic school, they say, but not of Plato himself. And so certainly there starts to be an industry of those sorts of works to get around, but I'm fairly comfortable with the set canon of Plato, that it's by someone nicknamed Plato from that period in Athens.
And
who was a master of Attic Greek.
Right. Earlier you said that you have a sort of you diverge from the standard chronology of Plato's writings. So you don't think that there's. I mean, as I understand it, the standard reading is that, or the standard narrative is that the statesman represents, and maybe also the laws represent his political thinking after his experiences in Syracuse, which you also disregard. So
yeah, that's right.
So
that's right. That's yeah. Right. You see, all of these readings of Plato depend upon supposed biographies and other factors that I'm just not sure about. And even if you are sure about those things, it's useful to get rid of those guardrails and read Plato differently.
So just that the kind of hermeneutical implication of what you're saying then may be that one could read the statesman and not as representing a kind of a development from his thought in the Republic, but as consistent with each other.
Yeah. I mean, the central problem here is that normally, and this is how collected dialogues are usually set out, and that's usually how it's taught too. You start with the apology, and it's an early work, and you leave the Parmenides till the end because it's a late work and just too complicated. And yet, that means we start at Socrates' death and work backwards to the point where he's a young man.
Mm.
Maybe we should start with the Parmenides, the first dialogue. Maybe that's where Plato started, and the rest of it is backtracking. You could read it like that. I don't see any reason why not to. Plato's dialogues are so intertextual, so extraordinarily intertextual. I struggle to determine any order to most of them. Like the Timaeus is an example. It starts with what is clearly an allusion to the Republic. But it can't be. Was it written after or before the Republic? Was it? I can't tell. And so, and yet, most conventional readings of Plato, if you look at it, they depend upon a supposed chronology of dialogues and a supposed biography, and also readings imported from Aristotle. And I try not to do any of that. But I mean, I was, that's the standard way to read it.
Well, as you know, being as skeptical of democracy as you know I am, I'm being in a minority doesn't render you suspicious, in my view.
Yeah, I think that Leo Strauss is good because he went back and he said, there's different ways to read Plato. Goodness, we don't have to read this in sort of the British Cambridge tradition or even the German tradition. There's lots of different ways to read Plato, and I think that's wholesome. That's good.
So where should...
And if we're looking for him as a political thinker, like Strauss was, that's the thing to do. Get rid of the guardrails and rethink it.
So Strauss is one of those thinkers that I've heard an awful lot about, but never actually read. So, where should one start with Strauss as far as Plato
What's
is
it called?
concerned?
Man in the City.
Man in the City.
I think it's Man. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a fabulous book. It's his central work on the polity, on the state. What exactly is the state and how does it operate? And yeah, he's fabulous. I think Strauss is really good. It's a pity that his name has become connected with the neocons, whatever they are. You know, that's a misnomer too. But I don't think that that's Strauss. I don't even see the connection. There's a lot more in Strauss. Strauss is very good. Someone like Michael Milliman is an advocate of Strauss and presents good courses on Strauss. But Strauss is a Platonist. I mean, it's a creative way of reading Plato as a political thinker.
And as I understand it, Strauss's method is that these should all be read as having been texts written with exoteric meanings.
Yes.
I mean that.
Yeah, Strauss is a Machiavellian. He's a Machiavellian. In this sense, the way Strauss operates is he thinks that philosophy is dangerous. Philosophers are dangerous. They are dangerous to the city. Because they ask too many questions and they make important things problematic. They're disruptive. And so that's in the first instance. That's how he sees that. And so he thinks that in Plato's very aware of this. After all, they killed Socrates. They put him to death. Plato's teacher was executed. Plato is going to be very careful what he writes. And so Strauss thinks there's a subtext throughout Plato, yes.
But is there a kind of unified message or a through line to that subtext, or is it?
Yeah. The way Strauss, I think this is right. The way he sees it is Plato understands that in the end there's only power. Thrasymachus is right in the Republic. There's only power. But he also knows, because he's wise, that men can't live like that. And that for Strauss, the whole theory of forms and all of that, it's all a mythology that's necessary to prevent us from destroying ourselves. That's the way Strauss reads it. He thinks that's how Plato understands it. Plato knows that in the end it's just raw power. But we can't live like that. And so we have to construct this superstructure over the top just to make life bearable. And similarly, Strauss believes that Plato is an atheist and that he knows that there's no afterlife or anything, but men can't live like that. Myths are necessary. The noble lie. That's a Straussian reading of Plato. And so it invites a totalitarian sort of politics that says, well, you know, we have to feed comforting myths to the populace. It could feed into that sort of politics.
Yeah, I mentioned Sorel earlier, that sort of thing.
Yes, I should say that's not my reading of Plato. That's Strauss's reading.
No, I was going to
nevertheless,
say...
he's an interesting...
Yeah, I was going to say I find that a phenomenally unattractive reading of Plato.
Yeah, it's a totally unattractive reading, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, actually quite ugly one. But yeah, I mean, interesting nonetheless.
But I think it's Man in the City by Strauss. It's a great book. It's Yeah.
it can't help it sort of elicits or gives me a. It calls to mind these very popular readings of Confucius as being a kind of atheist who just sort of entertained conventional worship of the gods, which I by the way think is completely erroneous. I think it's a totally wrong reading of
Yeah.
Confucius.
Yeah.
I mean, the sort of thing that it says is that, Confucius says, well, you should keep your distance from the gods, but he also says you should keep your distance from your father. So, if that's evidence that he doesn't believe in gods, I wonder what that says
Yeah.
about,
Yeah.
um, so yeah, I'm rather suspicious of these, um, it seems to me that there's, and again, I say this not having read Strauss, so that's a big qualification, but I'm very suspicious of these readings that they want to claim traditional minds that are respected in modernity for modernity by sort of cleansing them of all this uncomfortable metaphysical and spiritual dimension.
Yeah. True. And the only reason it's forgivable in Strauss is because he at least went back to the classics. He reopened debates and just discourse about classical political theory in a way that other people hadn't. So I think that's a good thing in itself, and Plato in particular. A lot of people have gone back to Aristotle, but Plato really needed to be reconsidered after, in the post-war period with Popper and so forth. Plato was pretty unpopular.
Although that reading, the Straussian one, or at least as you've presented it, doesn't really seem to contradict the Popperian presentation of Plato, does it?
No, I guess not. I guess not. No,
it seems to sort of reinforce his view of him as a kind of ur-totalitarian. Yeah. There's a if you still have time, there's just a couple of things I wanted to pick your brains about, to sort of thought things I thought you might know much more about than I. So I hope to benefit from it, and maybe the audience will too.
We'll see.
Well, the whole Neoplatonic tradition is very interesting, but from what I've seen from it, and this might just be my own ignorance rather than sort of being reflective of reality, or maybe it's just the academic focus, but Neoplatonism seems to focus very much on Plato's metaphysics and also kind of developing a method for realization, and it doesn't seem to have an awful lot to say about his politics. Am I incorrect in that impression, or
no? I think that I'm not a Neoplatonic scholar, but I think that's generally correct. Yes. There's the way I usually depict it is there's several branches that come out of Plato. There's the ethical Plato, and that goes into Stoicism and so on, and feeds into the Stoic tradition, which is, not a bad thing. And then there's the metaphysics, which is sort of pursued in the Neoplatonic tradition. And then there's also the cosmology, which is what I've particularly pursued, and that goes into alchemy in particular.
So, and it's also interesting because there's another. We started this whole conversation with the similarities with the Chinese tradition, that's there also. The Neo-Confucians, also weren't particularly much more interested, let's say, in the metaphysics than the metaphysics and the ethics than the politics. But is there anything the Neoplatonists had to say about the politics?
I don't know. I'm not familiar enough. Everyone lives in a political context, and so they had to deal with politics in some way. Whether there's anything in their writings or not, I don't know, because my reading of the Neoplatonists has been fairly selective. I've just been looking for the metaphysical stuff and the cosmological stuff. So I'm not sure. I haven't been looking for any political stuff, and I haven't come across any. No.
Right. Because it's something what interests me, but it doesn't seem to be an awful lot of it. I remember reading something about one of the. I mean, it might be Plotinus. I'm not. I wouldn't swear by that. But having tried to set up a kind of Platonic commune in the Middle East.
Yeah, there is that. The Neoplatonists, like the Pythagoreans before them, and perhaps other people within that orbit, do provide examples of communal living dedicated to an intellectual life, either on a small or a larger scale. So that you can think of that as a political unit in that sense.
I mean, it would have
it's a group of people surrounding a teacher.
Mm.
Yeah, much as you get in India and elsewhere. Yeah.
But it must have... Sorry.
But they do write about that and provide examples of that.
Of living communally, or...
Communal living of a life devoted to the intellectual life, usually grouped around a particular teacher.
Very interesting.
So in that, I think, although this is just my general impression, I think that they try to implement what they take to be Plato's political life as well. So they may adopt habits and things that they think are Platonic. Vegetarianism might be one, for instance.
Mm-hmm. And Plato's vegetarianism is not something I know, or Platonic vegetarianism is not something I know very much about. What's the? I mean, it's a political question. Or at least it is in the modern context. And what's the thought I mean, is that closer to sort of Hindu Buddhist?
I don't. Yeah, I don't see any particular. Particular vegetarianism in Plato himself, Plato's works, but there is in the Pythagorean tradition, and in as much as Plato's within that tradition, Platonists might adopt it. There is let's see, Roger Sauter for many years was a vegetarian on Platonic grounds, but certainly other Platonists aren't, and it's not a but it's not uncommon, I think, among Platonists. But it's indirect. It's Pythagorean.
But what are the grounds? Are they ethical, or is it sort of like the Gnostics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm really not sure. I don't think that it's on the grounds of concerns for animal welfare. Those sort of ethical grounds. Mm-hmm. It's more a spiritual discipline.
Right,
and possibly it's designed not to stir the passions or something like that. I don't know.
And I'm just wondering out loud now, but I wonder now if maybe there's a line of influence there between that and the vegetarianism of certain Gnostic sects.
Yeah, I actually in Plato and Pythagoras, it goes with reincarnation. It does. Yeah. It goes with traditions of reincarnation. There's the story of Pythagoras, that someone kicked the dog and Pythagoras says, leave him alone. He was a good friend of mine in the last lifetime. Those sort of stories.
And I mean, I'm sure it's fairly obvious that one could point there to a kind of common Aryan root between that and the Hindu tradition.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and that's also true because, for instance, Roger Sauter, the particular type of Platonist that he was interested in the parallels between Plato and the Indian tradition, the caste tradition, the Advaita Vedanta, and so forth. And lots of Platonists do that, but that didn't happen to me. I haven't pursued Plato into the Indian tradition in that way.
So I have a last question, and it seems sort of relevant to that note. Do you know of any sort of continuation of Platonic political thought amongst Christian or Islamic Platonists?
Political thought?
Yes, I mean, perhaps commentaries.
Other than, say, Ibn Farabi.
Well, there's a start. Let's. What does Ibn Farabi have to say about?
Oh well, he's Islamic Platonist, and so he sort of turns the philosopher of kings into prophets, and he has a prophetology. And Strauss is the main scholar who revived all that. But no, in general, you'll find that Aristotle permeates Christian and Islamic thought much more than Plato.
That's interesting.
With some real exceptions. For instance, Thomas More and many notable Christian Platonists. Wonderful tradition. But it's a minority tradition. Aristotle is the predominant thinker of Christian political thought. I think that it's fair to say that.
But what's interesting to me and a little surprising is that that's the case also amongst in the Islamic world.
Yeah, I think so. I think it is. But in the Islamic world, for many, many centuries, Plato and Aristotle were thoroughly confused, and that's a whole nother issue. Mixing together Plato and Aristotle and separating them correctly and all of that. That's another matter. Whatever Plato there is in the Islamic tradition was probably called Aristotle at the time.
I see.
Although with notable exceptions.
Well, that's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, the reason it surprises me is I would have thought that someone in the Shia tradition, at least in the Shia tradition, would find some kind of resonance.
That they possibly have, and I'm just not au fait with it. Yeah, that's probably so. Islamic political thought is not something that I've pursued. I've pursued, spiritual texts and things like that, but not so much political philosophy in Islamic context.
And it's
so it's possibly so, especially as you say in the Shia world. Yeah. And I'd be surprised if it wasn't there.
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, I'm very much expected it to be. I don't know for a fact that it is. So it's something I'd very much like to discover and excavate. I mean, it's Islamic political thought is a very difficult thing to approach nowadays because it's buried under so much. I mean, if you want to get, what precedes the fall of the caliphate, that's difficult because it's buried under the Qutubs and the Maududis and the Khomeinis.
Oh, yeah.
So it's something...
Yeah, it's a period of flux. We're in a period of flux and it's very hard to see through the smoke.
So, yeah, it would be... it's one of many things I'd like to do is sort of excavate traditional Islamic political thought, because I'm sure were very interesting... things that were said, both sort of entirely indigenously to the tradition, but also in dialogue with Plato and Aristotle.
And it's always interesting to see how Muslims try to extract modern ideas from their tradition too, so that they'll conceive of the Ummah as a democracy sort of idea, or things like that, or. Those sorts of things are interesting. And getting back before those to classical thought is, as you say, that's another undertaking, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think I exhausted the questions I had. So I'm just looking through my list because we didn't go through them in the order that I wrote them down. Yeah, I think I got it. And unless you think there's anything very important on sort of...
just a final thought on Islam, actually.
Yeah, please.
What you have in Islam is a nomocracy. It's like in the book of Judges in the Bible. There's no legislator. There's already legislation. All you need are judges. And the example of it that I like to use is found in Marmaduke Pixel, Mohammed Pixel, who travelled through the Levant in the 1880s, 90s, that sort of period, maybe a bit later, and he described Lebanon and that area. He said it was idyllic. He said there were villages where people hadn't seen a policeman for generations. There was no effective rulership. There was Sharia, there was the law, there was democracy, and there was no judges except if you needed one, which was rarely. And as far as they were concerned, the Sultan, who they had a picture of in their living room, he lived in Istanbul, far, far away. He protected their boundaries, but otherwise left them alone. And that's so Pixel gives this beautiful description of life in the late Ottoman Empire, there of rule by nomocracy, where you have this permeating layer of law that just means that you don't need to enforce it. And in some ways, strong cultures are like that. Japanese cultures like that. You don't have to have the big stick to stop people from jaywalking. They just don't. They're the culture's like that. It's encultured. I think that's a really nice picture from Pixel. But Islamic politics, in the end, is nomocratic, which is what makes it different.
I mean, it is very beautiful and very attractive. And I wonder about sort of the similarities with certain other. There's two things in particular it calls to mind. What I mean, of course that's a city-state, but Rome before the 12 tables were. Right before
that's right. There may be other parallels to that. Yeah, that's right.
But before the introduction of positive law in Rome, yes, I it's put it that way. Or the other sort of, and in certain, in a different way is traditional China, because yes, you had the emperor, but the emperor was generally far away and didn't have much to do with enforcement locally. And law was sort of generated from the Confucian tradition as a...
Yes, correct.
In a very similar way.
That's very similar, yeah. And in fact, when you think about it, it's probably a situation that arises very often in traditional world.
Yeah, I mean, one also thinks of the rule of the judges in ancient Israel. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, there's something, maybe I should write something about this. There's something sort of inherently, well, I mean, as things I have written sort of touched on this, there's something inherently oppressive about positive law.
Yes, yeah.
That's
right. I think that's a very Islamic point of view. That's right.
Well, yeah, I mean,
but of course, in Islamic modern states, you often end up with the worst of both worlds. You get that, you have that bedrock of law, and then you have this oppressive state on top of it.
Well, and also the way the Sharia is administered in modern Islamic states is very untraditional because.
That's right.
It's sort of administered as national law without any kind of consideration for local particularity.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, what strikes me as very similar between the traditional Islamic and Chinese way of doing things is that judgments were passed by people who lived in communities and knew the people involved often and sort of took the particularities into consideration.
Yeah.
And the driving ethos was to sort of conform to the will of heaven, but taking particularity.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right.
Rather than wanting to conform to the stipulated dictate of the state, informed by the will of heaven though it may be. And it's produces something that's sort of both orderly and free. Which you can't have in in modernity. I mean, yeah, it's certain. I've heard descriptions of the Soviet Union which get its, where you get the opposite, right, where it's both oppressive and chaotic.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
That's right. Yeah,
you have to
you do.
negotiate the state and then also negotiate the mafiosi running your housing block.
Yes. Yeah. That's
Um,
the worst of both worlds. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah. So I very much enjoyed this conversation. We didn't have the technical difficulties we had last time, so I'm very happy about that.
No, that was good. That was good. Yeah, I enjoyed it too. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you very much, and hopefully we can squeeze because as you know, Skype is going to be or you may not know, Skype's going to be discontinued in May. So, and that's what I'm using to conduct this.
Oh no, I didn't know. I
Yeah,
didn't know.
it's going to be
Okay.
retired. So, if at some point before the beginning of May we could squeeze in that conversation, a sort of loose conversation of I don't know how I'll title that, maybe the occult and occult currents
Yeah.
and
Okay.
politics. But yeah, it
Yeah, I'd be
would be an
happy to do
interesting.
that.
Yeah, would be an interesting chat. Just let me know when you think you're up to that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, would be good. Uh, Anyway, till then, I hope you have a good day.
All right. Okay. Thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. Thanks.
As always, thank you. Right. Bye for now.
Bye.
If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi, links in the description. If you'd prefer to read my essays over the video format, they are all available in written form on Substack, link also in the description.